2, 1.
Hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to you from wherever you're joining us from across the globe. I'm Dr. Rose Harris-Burtill from the School of English here at the University of St Andrews in Scotland, and for today's Meet the Author event it is my great pleasure to welcome the author Paul Cumbo back to St Andrews, albeit virtually, as an alumnus who previously completed his MLitt degree in creative writing with us in the School of English in 2005. So today we're going to be discussing Paul's recent book, Wilderness Therapy, and he'll also be treating us to a reading from the book as well. And in the second half of the event, we'll then take your questions for Paul, so please do feel free to post these as we go, and we'll get to as many of these as we can in the time we've got. You can also submit your questions for Paul using the Q&A function, so please do post this at any point throughout the evening. So, to introduce tonight's author then, well, Paul Cumbo has nearly 2 decades of experience teaching English at Jesuit high schools for boys. He's coached rowing for 12 years, during which his crews earned multiple US and Canadian national championship titles. He's also served as a swimming coach, retreat director and service learning coordinator. And Paul's books include 2 novels, Wilderness Therapy and Boarding Pass, as well as a short fiction collection, 10 stories, and Blue Doors, which is an institutional history. His articles have appeared in US News and World Report, the Buffalo News, and Independent Ideas. He's also an editorial consultant and freelance writer, and he co-founded the Camino Institute, which offers immersive service-oriented retreats in the Dominican Republic. Paul lives near Buffalo, New York, where he's joining us from this evening, or should I say this afternoon, to everybody watching in New York, and he lives there with his wife and children. So without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to hand over to our author, Paul Cumbo.
Thank you, Rose, and thank you to everyone who's joining us this afternoon or evening, wherever you happen to be. I believe it's great to start everything with gratitude, and so I want to thank the university for hosting me. It is wonderful to make a return to a place that was so formative for me at a time in my life when a great deal was changing, and the adventure of my vocation as a teacher and as a writer was beginning to take real shape and form. I'd like to thank a few people in particular before we get started, and the first was my mentor at St Andrews, which is Professor Douglas Dunn, and Professor Dunn offered me some fantastic insights that helped me craft and hone my writing skills, and he injected a very, very good sense of humor into everything and every conversation. And of course, John Burnside and Professor Crawford and Megan Delahunt, and Megan in a special way I'd like to thank because she helped me really discover some weaknesses and opportunities in my own writing, and she was always a friendly face that helped me and so many students at St Andrews during our time. So thank you so much for having me. I'd like to start with a reading just from the very beginning of Wilderness Therapy, and my readings will be relatively brief. I'd like to prioritize questions from the audience. So this is from the very first page of chapter 1 of Wilderness Therapy. Mike Whitaker's father always left for work before dawn, while the rest of them slept. So when Mike woke up, peered through the frosted panes of his bedroom window, and noticed his dad's pickup truck still in the driveway, he rubbed his eyes, pulled on a sweatshirt, and trudged downstairs to see what was up. Maybe a snow day, he thought, savoring the possibility of pancakes and a lazy morning of video games. But the kitchen was still. Other than the low rumble of the furnace kicking on and the dripping faucet, no sign of pancakes. Instead, Mike found his dad sprawled at a weird angle on the front porch, clutching his keys. His thermal coffee mug lay on its side, still steaming, the dark liquid spreading into a pool of brown slush on the stone steps. As he stood by the casket at the wake, people told him that everything happens for a reason. His voice cracked when he tried to thank them, his narrow shoulders hunched, sweating in a cheap, itchy suit next to Mom and Andrew. It was an endless line of tearful handshakes and hugs, perfume and aftershave, breath mints, his mother's mascara running down her cheeks, eyes red from crying. Andrew leaned against her, clinging to her leg, neck craned to look up at the crying grown-ups. Occasionally, Mike stole a glance at the casket. There was a piece of lint on his dad's shoe. He almost reached in to brush it off, but he couldn't quite do it. It would get buried too. He wondered, what had they done with his father's defective heart? Did they take it out, toss it somewhere, incinerate it? Or was it still in there, seized up like a damaged engine, pumped full of embalming fluid? Mike decided he would never know. And as they buried his dad on the shortest day of the year, just before Christmas, his heart broke too. As the earth tilted, light grew steadily into the spring of his 14th year. Melting snow cascaded, plummeting in flumes and spray over ancient granite, and the primeval forest surrounding their small Adirondack town yawned, stretched, and hummed with new energy. Soon the mill where his father had labored with other tough northern men rumbled to life, and the air once again carried the clean, honest scent of cut timber. It had lingered always in his father's rugged flannel and his sap-stained boots. As the shock subsided and he began to accept his father's death, Mike embraced all that stuff about things happening for a reason, about life going on. It was true. He drew strength from it. Life went on. Until 3.5 years later, when that wisdom would abruptly cease to mean anything to Mike, and those who'd peddled such nonsense, himself among them, became so many fools.
Thank you very much. Thank you. That was a beautiful passage. And I think I'd also like to begin really our discussion this evening by echoing your thanks. Thank you for coming to choose St Andrews originally as well. And thank you for joining us this evening. That was a very beautiful passage, I think, to open with, and introduces, I think, a lot of the themes that you see coming through later on in the book, and this kind of grief that sort of shapes Mike's approach as the book goes on. So I think to open then, I'd like to ask, what inspires your writing?
I think principally my life as a teacher has inspired my writing. There are a lot of vocations out there. People pursue different careers. Some people love what they do. Some people probably detest what they do. One of the beauties of the career and the vocation that I've chosen in teaching is that it is a constant window in to the life of young people. It is a constant glimpse of emerging life at a time that's very dynamic, a time when people are figuring out a great number of things about who they are and who they wish to be. And a couple of decades of teaching and seeing that stage of life on full display in front of me has given me a profound love for that stage of life, of early adolescence and early adulthood. And so much of my writing is, I suppose I would say, an exploration of that stage of life, of that self-discovery, of that intertwining and intermingling of people's lives as they begin to realize what the world is about and what the place is in that world. For me specifically, as a teacher of boys and young men, I have tried in my work to explore the landscape of masculinity, because I think it's a nuanced landscape that is sometimes oversimplified in the popular culture. And I often, when I'm speaking about the book and I'm speaking about that theme of exploring the landscape of masculinity, I refer to the Grand Canyon over here in the States. And most people have seen an image of the Grand Canyon if they haven't visited it themselves. And I think it's a fantastic metaphor for the complex landscape of the interior masculine life. And I think the reason why I choose the canyon rather than a mountain is that the canyon is subterranean, and so much of it is under the surface. And there are powerful forces at work that have shaped it and that continue to shape it. It's very nuanced, and the closer you get to the rocks in the landscape, the more you realize just how much striation and geologic diversity is there. And yet from the distance, it's hard to see what's in the depths of that canyon. And so to travel that canyon as a companion and as a teacher to so many young men over the years as a teacher, I have just developed a fascination with that, and I like to bring it out in stories. So I suppose that's the motivation for my writing.
Well, that's fantastic. I like the way that you also picked up on, you were saying so much is under the surface. And I think that's a wonderful kind of idea that runs throughout the book. There's so much going on that we don't see, and there's so much going on in the lives of the characters that we only learn kind of very gradually. I certainly know as a writer, there's a lot going on kind of under the surface as well, behind the scenes of the book that we don't get to see in terms of your writing process. So I think that probably leads me on to my next question that I wanted to ask. How do you go about approaching the fiction writing process yourself?
I start by procrastinating. I'd like to say that I'm a disciplined writer who sits down with a plan and dedicates writing at least 10 minutes a day in the way that you read on the writing blogs. I don't know if anybody actually does. I tend to write when I've got something more important that I have to do, and I need to procrastinate. And I think of stories. And as a father of young children, there's always stories emerging. There are stories in the minutiae of daily life. There are stories in making dinner. There are stories in helping a child get ready for bed. But of course, there are stories in daily life, interacting with people out in the world that are quite compelling. And so for me, I think that stories, to give you a more serious answer, my stories begin with characters. And in my conversations with other writers, I think that you can make two broad categories of how people approach writing. There are more than two, I suppose, but you could make this categorization. There are those who are very much plot oriented and plot driven, and they're very good at constructing a narrative arc. They're very good at visualizing that Freytag's pyramid of exposition and rising action and crisis and climax and falling action and resolution, and they're able to weave things together in a very nice sort of Shakespearean Elizabethan 5-act play. With a beginning, middle, and end. I struggle with that, and in fact I need editors to help me with that. And when I reach out to professional editors, I tell them up front, I say, I need you to help me organize these visions of characters and these emotional vignettes and these portraits of interior life into a story that means something. I know it means something, but I need help with it. So for me, it is character driven. I will find myself envisioning a character. Sometimes it will be in a defined setting, sometimes it'll be in a particular circumstance, other times it might just be a look in the eye or something rather abstract, and that character will begin to take on life for me. That character will begin to speak to me, and I'll begin to see him and him or her, and then I'll begin to craft a story about who that character is and why that character is where he or she is, and that's how my stories take form. So they begin with characters, and then a story forms around those characters. I guess that's how I would summarize my process.
Wonderful. No, that's fascinating. And I think from there, actually, I'd like to move, if we may, into discussing this evening's book. I really enjoyed reading this, and I would have to say it's not a sort of massive tome, but I read it very, very quickly. I found myself kind of unable to put this down, wanting to find out what would happen. And I also wanted to ask, Paul, for anybody that's joining us this evening, hopefully everybody's read the book already, but anybody that's maybe not finished or hasn't had chance to join, but is also very welcome to join us this evening, could you maybe offer a brief summary just to help anybody that's unfamiliar or refresh the memories of our audience?
Sure. Yes, I can do that. Wilderness Therapy is centered on a 17-year-old protagonist named Mike Whitaker, who, in the wake of his father's death, is really struggling on an existential level when a secondary tragedy, the death of his little brother, descends upon his family in their small upstate New York town. And in the subsequent to that loss, Mike descends into what I think is fair to call an abyss of depression. And when he realizes that there's a little bit more to the story of his brother's death than merely accidental circumstances, rage is a powerful thing that manifests quickly and unexpectedly for Mike, as it does, I'm sure, for so many of us. And Mike carries it out to violent ends. And in the wake of those violent ends, Mike is issued a chance for redemption, along with a group of other young men like him, under the supervision of 2 military veterans and law enforcement officials who run a wilderness-based therapeutic program in the mountains of Montana, which is near the Canadian border over here in the States. And Mike travels into the backwoods of Montana with quite a cast of characters. And from there, the story becomes one of self-exploration. It becomes one of emerging stories in the backgrounds and the backdrops of these fellow characters, and what I think is an interesting mentoring dynamic between Mike and Liz and Jim, the couple who run this program. And I will keep spoilers out of it, but things take an unexpected turn as a result of one character's misdeeds and mysterious background, and it, I think, transforms into a bit of a thriller, into a bit of a survival narrative that ends with an arc toward redemption toward the end of the novel.
Thank you. Very, very well summarised, and I do have to say it was a very gripping read with quite the twist at the end. Again, I won't give it away, but yeah, really, really interesting and really kind of excellent read for kind of the winter evenings that we're going through at the moment. One of the questions that I've got then, we've got Mike's coming of age story that kind of structures the novel. And I know that you have many, many years of teaching experience, so you must have seen a fair few coming of age stories sort of being enacted as part of your teaching. So how did your experiences of working with teenage boys actually feed into creating these characters of these kind of troubled adolescents that we see in the book?
I think it's a great question. Fiction is true in the sense that it reflects human experience. It's a bit of a cliche, but sometimes cliches are cliches because they're so very true. And yeah, certainly, you know, years of working with boys and young men informs some of the characteristics and the qualities that emerge in these characters. And none of them is based on a particular person. I think that's dangerous territory to go into when you're writing fiction, of course. But I think what I was trying to capture, based on what I've experienced and articulate in these characters and in their stories, is the fact that adolescent life, and I don't think this is exclusive, you know, to young boys or young men in any way, but I think adolescent life in general is characterized by a mixture of very messy experience and very poignant beauty. There is a great deal of mess associated with the time of life when we are figuring out who we are and who we are not. There are many mistakes. It is a clumsy time of life. Very often it is an experimental time of life. There is plenty of collateral damage that occurs. And yet at the same time, not just despite that, but maybe because of some of the mess, there is great beauty, because there is refinement happening, and there's self-discovery happening, and there's the building of relationships happening, and there's the, I believe there's the sharpening of the aim over a period of years toward that which we want to become, and the vision of our most authentic desires begins to sharpen its focus in those adolescent years. Sometimes in spite of our best efforts to muddle everything up. So I like the interplay of very profound and sometimes quite catastrophic messiness that is associated with the adolescent years, with the emerging and very poignant and very real and authentic beauty of the human condition that begins to clarify itself in those times.
Brilliantly put, I think. And I like the way you were talking about that sort of messiness that turns into clarity that we sort of hopefully experienced as we've kind of go through that period of time. As part of that sort of clarity, if you like, I noticed that redemption, I think, is one of the really interesting themes that really stood out for me in the book as we follow this group of kind of really quite troubled young men going into this wilderness therapy program, and their attempts to kind of make sense of their difficult pasts, but also to find find some kind of redemption themselves. So I wanted to ask, can you say a little bit more about redemption in the book and what it means both to your characters and also to you?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because, you know, the story is, and if this is a spoiler, well, executive decision, I'm going to spoil it. It is a redemptive story. I don't think that gives away too much in particular. And redemption, you know, redemption is not a neat, it's not a neat closure. It's not necessarily things being fixed or things being neatly rearranged the way we would have them be. I think redemption, well, by definition, there has to be something from which the redemption emerges, and that has to be, by definition, struggle and suffering. Because if there's no suffering and struggle, there can't be any redemption, just as if you can't turn the lights off, we don't know when they're on. And I was talking about this with my students not that long ago, and I introduced them to the Greek term pathos. And what's interesting about the Greek term pathos is that when you translate it to English, depending on which scholarly translation you read and how it's articulated, roughly it translates as two separate things. One is experience, and the other is suffering. And I find it very interesting that the Greeks equated suffering with experience and experience with suffering, because isn't suffering really the way that we muddle our way through the world and figure out who we are and figure out what the world means and find meaning in things and differentiate, you know, the good from the bad, etc. And so I think that redemption, you know, for me personally in my own life, and I think for so many of us as we emerge from adolescence through young adulthood and into middle age and hopefully beyond that, I'll let you know, are in a process of looking at the messes that we've made or that have been made around us, sometimes have been made of us by others, and we're finding ways to coexist with that and to look at the suffering as part of our experience, not as something to be avoided necessarily or feared or always regretted, but rather as an intrinsic part of what defines what life means for us. And so the reason why I think redemption is powerful in the novel is that we can't erase the past. The characters in the book, the boys in the book, each have a relatively nasty moment in their past, and it isn't going away. And their desire is to pretend it didn't happen, but their mentors make them put it out in the open very much in a compelling way, and to face it and to own it, and to say, yes, that is, but that is not all. And you know, we are what we repeatedly do. We are not what we repeatedly did. And I think that is a very important thing for, you know, for my students and for people in general, to have that message echoed. And in amidst all the difficulty is not mutually exclusive from beauty and possibility. And that's how life is. And that, I think, is encouraging and hopeful as much as it is realistic.
Absolutely. I think that's beautifully kind of summarized there and gives us a lot to think about. Talking about this sort of idea of redemption, also, I think leading on from that, the idea of the journey that the boys go through in the book. I noticed one thing that I picked out is there's a necklace with a cross that Mike is given at the start of his journey. And that's kind of the only bit of sort of overtly religious iconography that we receive in the book. But there isn't this sort of massive religious discovery or anything at the end, but there does seem to me that there's a sort of deeply spiritual journey in some ways going on throughout the book, which really left me wanting to kind of know more. Can you maybe say a bit more about this?
Sure. There is what I'd like to think of as a nuanced or subtle spiritual, I don't know if it's an overtone or if it's a motif that you might not even notice it if you're not attuned to looking for it at all. And that was intentional, because I did not want that to be something that was that dominated the narrative at all. But I think for me, my own Catholic upbringing, and I teach in Jesuit high schools, and so Catholic spirituality and Ignatian spirituality specifically, that introduced by St. Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits, forms a very, I think, innate part of my thought process and my approach to the world. And for me, that spirituality is predicated on a quest for authentic freedom. And what I mean by freedom, in the sense, is not the ability to pursue any passing desire or to have a complete absence of restrictions, but rather to go through life in a way that is discerning of authentic desires, the ones that are most true, and being able to differentiate those from desires that are not particularly true to our deepest hungers and our deepest vision for who we are. And from a religious standpoint, I equate our deepest understanding of ourselves with that which God has for us as well. But for the novel's purposes, that notion of freedom is something that Mike is really striving for. And when he wears the cross that his father used to wear, and his mother bestows it upon him almost like a talisman, as you said, in a very symbolic moment in early on in the story, in that Mike has to carry that cross, right? Mike, I think, is striving for the sort of deep freedom, the very authentic freedom that comes with believing in and accepting his own self-worth despite the messiness that we talked about before. And so, yes, I think that the cross is symbolic of that journey. It is symbolic of that quest for the freedom that comes with that redemption.
Thank you. And we're talking a lot about this idea of a kind of journey. And so there's a sort of spiritual journey, but there's also the sort of exploration of masculinity and masculinities that goes on in the book, which you mentioned earlier on. And it struck me on reading it that the story, although it's sort of about this group of boys and we follow what they get up to, it also seems to hinge around the survival actually of Liz, who's this very kind of tough clinical psychologist who tries to help them, and they fight to save her life sort of throughout the latter part of the novel. So can you talk a bit more about Liz's character and her quite unusual sort of extraordinary role, I think, in Mike's journey?
Yeah, I would love to talk about Liz. Liz is, obviously, I have a soft spot for Mike because he's the central protagonist in the story, and he and I have spent a lot of time talking over the past 5 years. But Liz is, I think she's my favorite character in the story, and she's the one I find most compelling. And it's funny when you're writing. Well, I don't know when you're writing, but when I'm writing, I don't like to speak in generalizations, but when I'm writing, these characters, they take on a life and they surprise me, and they come up with things. And of course, I know it's in my imagination, and I'm coming up with it somehow. But Liz helped me figure out these boys. Liz helped me figure out the struggles that they're going through. And Liz, for those who haven't read the book, Liz is an Air Force veteran who was a clinical psychologist who was involved in forensic psychology for many years, both in the military, but also later on in a law enforcement career that she is still sort of semi-retired, along with her husband, who is also a military vet and a law enforcement officer. And Liz has this unique insight into the pathologies at work with the boys who are in her and her husband's care. And I think the reason why Liz is such a compelling character among this crew of boys, and also in the company of her husband, as the sole female presence for really the majority of the book, is that Liz exerts an authority really over all of them. Her husband sort of half jokingly says that she's the brains of the operation, but she is, if not the brains of the operation alone, certainly the heart of the operation. But her authority in some sense is grounded in the fact that she's carrying a badge, and she's carrying a gun, and she is a law enforcement officer, and she has legal charge and authority over these boys who are really inmates of the state in a certain sense. But that's not where her actual authority comes from. And it becomes quickly apparent that her authority is an authority grounded in authenticity, in relatability, and the fact that when any of the boys is speaking to Liz and vice versa, there is absolutely no room for ambiguity when it comes to the truth. It is drawn out of the boys. Part of her approach and her clinical approach, which I did some research into, is to allow the boys to be forthcoming with their own facts and their own truth, and to let them work at their pace, and to be a profoundly incisive and effective listener. When what happens, and Liz becomes incapacitated, and I don't want to spoil too many things, so I'll leave the details out, but when that happens, she ceases to become an authority. She ceases to be an authority of the state, because she literally can't move or exert that authority or wield the badge or the gun. But her authority becomes even more powerful. It becomes more of an invitation for the boys to make decisions about which part of them is going to emerge. Is the nurturing side of them that they have associated with Liz going to come forth? And are they going to leverage that nurturing instinct, which is within them, which is very redeeming for them, such to the point where they're able to save her, so that she can in turn continue to save them. So I think she's the one that makes the story happen in so many ways. So I'm glad you picked up on her as a notable character.
Oh no, thank you very much. That's fantastic. We've got quite a few questions coming in on the chat from our audience this evening. So if it's all right with you, I'm going to jump over and put some of those to you now. So the first question that's come in here says, I felt the beginning of your novel is in a way natural, the world that we can imagine and feel close or similar to ours. However, I feel sometimes dwarfed by the fact that such a huge part of our present world, IT, information technology, is so far from us that we cannot really get in unless we're an IT person ourselves. How do you feel about this world away from our insight and reach? That's a fantastic question, given the virtual turn that our lives have all taken at the present. Anything to respond to that, Paul?
I'll try. Yeah, it's interesting. The digital world is a wilderness, in a sense, and I would define a wilderness as someplace into which we venture, that is apart from the familiar. And of course, wilderness can overlap with the familiar the more time we spend there, and so the definition of wilderness changes. So our interaction with the digital world, and I'm interpreting that as what's meant by IT, has changed. And certainly the pandemic, I think, has brought us all into all kinds of wildernesses, respectively. But we've learned to navigate that digital world in ways that we probably couldn't have a year ago, unless we'd made an intention to do so. And we probably wouldn't have, because we wouldn't have been compelled to. So I think that in a way we've all become a little bit more adept at navigating that. But we've also realized that separation from our normal routines imposed by the pandemic, and hence our immersion in that digital world, yields a little bit of a new wilderness that used to be familiar for us. So I think we have adapted. The last thing I would say about it is that wilderness is never comfortable, and if it gets to be comfortable, it's probably not wilderness anymore. So I guess there's a question of just how much in the wilderness are we in the digital world as we become more accustomed to it. And I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I would imagine, like most things in life, it's both.
Oh, that's brilliant. Thank you. It is an excellent question, I think, at the moment, where we've all had to sort of make our own peace with the new technologically driven socializing that a lot of us are finding ourselves having to do at the moment. So yeah, thank you very much for that. So moving on to the next question then, you've been asked, did you know about the theme of the book when you set out writing, given your writing process? I
don't know if I did. Well, when when you use the word theme, I guess I should back up and say yes. I think I did know about the theme, because as I said to you, I begin with a character, and I began with an image of this Mike. I didn't know he was Mike yet, but there was this kid, and he had some scars, physical and emotional, and he was in the mountains, and he was alone, and he was looking pensively off in the distance with his head down, much as is the case on the cover of the book. And I have to give credit to my brother, who's a professional illustrator. David Cumbo did a fantastic job, I think, evoking that feeling. That really was the first image that came into my mind. And I knew that this kid was suffering, and I knew that this kid was seeking redemption. I didn't know what for, and I didn't know what for a while. But yeah, the theme was there. And I think themes and characters can emerge simultaneously for me. And sometimes the plot is something that figures itself out later on. But if the theme is somewhat of an end point, and then, you know, if you know the end point, then you can navigate, and you can figure out how to get there. But yeah, it's difficult to get anywhere if you don't know where you're going. So I think so, yes. I think the themes became apparent pretty early on.
Fantastic. Thank you. Okay, so moving on to the next one. How much of your story do you finish when you approach editors to help you stitch the various bits of your writing?
As an independently published author, I work with editors. I like to employ professional editors, and that comes at some expense. So I don't like to engage them until I feel that the story has reached a stage where there's not too much more I can do with it without the poking and prodding that will come from a trained narrative expert. And so I certainly complete a first draft, and then I refine it a bit. What I find an editor does is an editor doesn't just, you know, fix sentences. I mean, that happens eventually, but that's very late in the process. What an editor, in my experience, will do, and I worked with a wonderful young woman who helped me reframe this story. An editor is very good at saying, yes, but not like that. You're saying these great things, and you've created the story, and you've got the pieces. Just rearrange the thing, because not like that. And it's astounding, and sometimes it's very frustrating, because, you know, you'll have the story in your mind, and you'll say, well, of course this is how it's going to proceed and how it's going to progress. But one of the things I've learned from an editorial process that was very productive, I think, with this novel, was that, you know, there are timelines in stories, and there's a chronology of telling, and then there's a chronology of how things happened. And, you know, usually, and anyone can realize this, when we tell a story, we generally don't start at the beginning and just, you know, tell things as they happen sequentially. That's not how we tell most of our stories. It's not how movies are portrayed. Very often there's a montage of things, and the chronology of the telling is serving a different master than the chronology of the events. And so what an editor has helped me do in that process is figure out, okay, you know the history of the story as though it were real. Now let's figure out what's the best order to tell it in. And sometimes it's literally move chapter 12 back to chapter 3, and you say, I can't do that. How can I do that? Well, it can be done. Just try it. And as a writer, you look at this rearranged puzzle piece, and I have things all over my digital, you know, wall, and say, well, that won't work, but it did. Yeah, I think that was a long answer to a question that wasn't really asked. Habit of mine, but it does have to be at least a complete narrative history told before I'll take it to an editor, and then I'll ask the editor, hey, editor, what's the best way to tell the story? And usually that means rewrite it 3 more times.
Brilliant. Yes, absolutely. I think any of us that have written before are familiar with that kind of the editorial process, all the work that goes in behind the scenes to trying to craft the finished object that comes out looking fully formed, but is actually the product of many, many, many rewrites. So thank you for that. That's fascinating. Sure. So the next question is an autobiographical one. It says, how much of Mike Whitaker is informed from your own life?
We're getting personal now. Not so well. Okay. Well, all of him, right? Because I wrote him. So in one sense, all of him. But you know, Mike Whitaker has endured hardships that I have not. Mike Whitaker has lost a parent. I have not yet. Mike Whitaker lost a sibling. Mike Whitaker comes from a family that faces challenges that I have not. And so in many ways, I cannot relate to him on a directly experiential level. But I have, at various times of my life, found myself completely lost and completely adrift and occasionally hopeless. And it hasn't happened in a very long time. But in my late adolescence and early adulthood, there was a stage of my life where my pilgrimage took me into some dark places and into a level of depression that took some effort and help and patience and redemption to climb out of. And so in that sense, I can very much relate to Mike as he stares into the abyss and it stares back at him. And it can be terrifying. It was terrifying writing some of the scenes where Mike is at, I think, the nadir of his depression, because they brought back some fairly, I don't like to use the word traumatic because it might be a little bit strong, but they certainly brought back some rather unsettling feelings and memories for me from a time of my life that was not so happy as it is now. So yeah, I know Mike a little bit. I don't know Mike on the level of everything he's experienced, but suffering is universal for all of us on some levels. And so we can familiarize ourselves with the suffering of others, even if we have not experienced the same things.
I think that was very well put. And a lot, I know there's a lot going on in the story with Mike's character, so that is a fascinating one because I had wondered that one myself, so good question. Okay, so moving along, the next question is, have you any marketing advice for a newly self-published author? Marketing
advice. There's a snarky answer, and the snarky answer would be give up hope and get an agent and don't be a self-published author. But that's not very helpful. And so I think the marketing advice I would give is base everything on relationships. You could put money into advertising on social media, and that will help you sell some books. It works. But for me, and this is a matter of opinion, I'm far more interested in building relationships with readers and knowing that those interested enough in the story that I've written have chosen to engage with it than I am in marketing to the masses. I would love for the masses to read Wilderness Therapy, and I am always searching for an agent, but it is a difficult quest. And I think the most important thing is to build a set of relationships with people who take an interest in what you do, and not to diminish the importance of those relationships just because it happens to be a small pool of people. If you can build a meaningful relationship with 100 readers through things like visiting with book clubs and doing events like this, and speaking with people and communicating with people and availing yourself, that can be more meaningful than a non-relationship with 1,000 readers. And it can also, I think, generate a bit of a domino effect where people talk about not just your book, but they're talking about the relationship they have with you through your book. Even if they're not very familiar with you, they have some connection. So I think that would be my marketing advice. But the best marketing advice really isn't about marketing. It's about produce a really, really good product and make sure that it's ready before you put it out to market. And that is expensive. You need a professional editor, absolutely. You need a professional cover designer, absolutely. and you're probably not going to make a lot of money on your self-published book. So if you can accept that and be at peace with that, and not allow that to be a discouraging fact, but rather an encouraging fact, because it frees you, then you can really run with your book, and you can have some fun with it, and it will have value for you that goes beyond the monetary.
Brilliant. Excellent piece of advice there. Feeding on from that, the next question says, can you talk about your own publishing story and how and why you self-published Wilderness Therapy?
You will find that the internet, there is an abundance of stories on the internet about how people have cavalierly, voluntarily chosen to self-publish because they don't like the man of the giant publishing machine, and they want the independent, the editorial independence, and who needs real big publishers anyway. It's all a bunch of malarkey, and everyone would like an agent, and everyone would like to be published by one of the big five, as we call them in publishing. And anybody who tells you they don't is probably trying to project a little bit of their own compensatory story on you. So I would prefer not to be self-published. There are some real advantages to self-publishing, and that's true. There is complete editorial control. The problem is there's complete editorial control. There is complete marketing control. The problem is there's complete marketing control. There is complete copyright ownership. The problem is there's complete copyright ownership. There's complete responsibility and freedom in marketing, and the problem, and so on and so on. So there is great freedom in self-publishing, but it also comes with considerable expense. It comes with considerable liability. I chose to do it because I tried to get an agent for many, many years. And this sounds like a sob story. It isn't. It is the reality. It's just math. There are, I don't have numbers. There are lots of writers. There aren't many agents. And there are very, very few publishing opportunities by the big presses. And so I queried, I won't get into the details, but I queried six-figure numbers of agents, hundreds of agents. Had my manuscripts requested by roughly 5% of those I queried, and always received the same response, which is, your work is very good, your work will have a readership. I don't know what that readership is in the market. Have a nice day. And that's the reality. So if there are any agents listening and you'd like to take me on, I'm here, I'm ready. But self-publishing is a decision not of desperation, but I think it's a decision that's rooted in a desire to share a story. And if it's looked at as an exigency, if it's looked at as the only remaining alternative of desperation, and you're going to say, fine, I'll self-publish, you probably shouldn't, because you're not in the right frame of mind. But if you can be at that peaceful place where self-publishing provides an avenue for sharing a story that matters to you with people whom you believe can take something of value from your story and be encouraged by it and be built by it, be challenged by it, then go for it. And it could not be easier than it is now to put something out into the world. The problem is that it couldn't be easier than now to put something out in the world, and so there is very little quality control. There are no barriers to entry in the publishing world. You could, right now, during the rest of the remaining 12 minutes of this cast, you could pen a story, you could upload it to Amazon, and you could have it available in the Kindle store within an hour and a half. What kind of quality will emerge from that is questionable, right? So I think it's an intentional decision, and it can be a very good one. And there's some really good self-published stuff out there.
Thank you. Great answer there, and a really interesting look at kind of behind the scenes that we don't usually sort of get to see when we just pick up a book. You don't really think about the publishing decisions on the part of the author as well. So thank you for that. Next question then says, I'm curious to know what kind of research you did on wilderness therapy programs whilst writing the novel.
That's a good question. I did some research into explicit programs that are out there. There are several of them here in the States and across the globe. I think that a great deal of my conversation has been with some clinical experts in adolescent psychology, coupled with my own experience of wilderness travel, because I do have a fair amount of backpacking and non-technical climbing experience and things like that that figure into the story. The coupling of expert opinion from those who do work in the world of counseling and therapy with my experience of the therapeutic benefits of being in the wilderness, I tried to mash those things together and then sprinkle in a little bit of what I hoped were good imaginative assumptions about how wilderness experience might benefit people suffering and people in that formative stage, and the result was this fictional wilderness setting program.
Fantastic, thank you. Next question that's come up is, as a writer, what's the most important thing that you have learned from writing this book? Oh, that's a very good question. The single most important thing that you've learned.
It's hard to pick out a single most important thing that I've learned, but I suppose it's that there are always more stories. I think that there is no shortage of surprises that can emerge when you begin to think deeply about the human condition, and there's an infinite supply of stories that can emerge even out of ordinary life and ordinary experiences. There's also, if you want to latch on to a theme of, for example, suffering and redemption, that can be, if you put a little creative energy into it and you have some discipline, you can find ways to discern those themes in the most mundane aspects of everyday life. And of course, if you want to take a more imaginative approach and go with speculative fiction or involve magic or use a fantasy setting or a science fiction setting, there's still stories about the human condition, because we're humans, and that's what we base our stories on. Even if the characters in our book have 5 legs and are purple and winged creatures that shoot laser beams from their eyes, they're still going to be grounded in the human experience. So I've learned that there's stories to be told that I don't know yet, just as the story of Mike and his companions emerged over time, and I didn't know where it was coming from. So that's encouraging. I think it's exciting to have learned that.
Excellent, thank you. So next question that we've got here, someone says, personally, the story seemed relatively compelling even before the major plot twist, since psychological healing is a very tough topic to cover. Do you think the plot of Wilderness Therapy could have been a compelling standalone story without the twist? Good question.
That is a great question. And yes, I think it could have been. In fact, my tendency is to explore the interior emotional life of characters in ordinary settings, and I have oftentimes in my writing tried to avoid cinematic turns of plot, things that would be conveyed with pyrotechnics in a movie, because I think there's plenty of compelling material between when we open our eyes and when we go to bed, even on an average work day or school day. However, and this is another editorial input, at one point it's helpful to have an editor say, hey writer, you're doing a nice job evoking character, and we can really relate to this person, but for God's sake, make something happen. Because if you don't, it's very interesting, but it isn't that compelling. And I said, oh, okay, right, something's got to happen, and don't be afraid to make it a little bit cinematic. And I found that that was a push for me to make what happened in the story happen, because it didn't come to me instinctively. I had to really be pushed to develop something that this questioner is referring to. But once I did, I found that it can be done in a way that that does not seem extravagant, that does not seem unbelievable. I think if we keep things grounded in reality, the ordinary can actually become quite cinematic, rather than the cinematic becoming ordinary. Yeah.
Thank you. Interesting what you were saying about the cinematic at the end. The next question says, are the locations all places that you visited yourself?
Yes, to a degree. I've been in the vicinity of the wilderness setting of the story. I've not been specifically in that place. The lake and the valley where the compound is located is an adaptation of a real place in the Teton Range of Wyoming that I have many photographs of and detailed notes of the scent of the timber and the feel of the air. But yeah, the Adirondacks figure largely, and that's a familiar stomping ground for me. That's the northern part of the Appalachian range of mountains here in New York State. And then Sedona, Arizona, which is where the novel concludes, is a place that's near and dear to my heart, having visited and spent some wonderful time there. Yeah, so it's a bit of an odyssey, and I'd like to try to bring those places to life that I have some authority of having been at or very near.
Wonderful, thank you. And another question that's come in here: do you have a daily word target?
No, I have 3 children. So no, I don't have a daily word target. My daily word target would be, it would be wonderful to write today, but I probably won't because I have 3 children. So my writing comes in fits and spurts when it's convenient and when it works out. And of course, if I did make it my primary day job, I would probably produce more, and it might become something different. But no, I like to retain the freedom of having it be something that I enjoy and that I approach really at my leisure, and something that I can do that I don't view it as an obligation, if that makes sense. I have total respect for writers who do approach it in that mode, and they're probably far more disciplined and structured than I am. But everybody approaches this in a different way.
Thank you. And one question here, which I think we'll probably need to make our last question of the night, but that I certainly couldn't let you go without asking, is I'd like to ask just a little bit more about your own time here with us in St Andrews. So how did your time here kind of impact on what came next for you, and what were your highlights of your time here at St Andrews University?
Well, it was a wonderful time. It came at a time in my life when I had made a decision 4 years prior to my arrival at St Andrews to make teaching my vocation. And I worked in a boarding school for 3 years, teaching and living in the vicinity of students, and that's very rigorous. It's a 24/7 engagement with students. And at the end of 3 years of that, I really needed to take that, I think, a very early career professional development deep breath. And so 3 years into it, I knew I was in it, but I needed to refine my craft. I needed to learn more about literature. I needed to see more of the world. I had a real travel bug. And so arriving in a place like St Andrews was marvelous for that. It was such a different pace. It is an ancient place. I remember looking at the cobblestones as I was walking frequently near the cathedral ruins. I lived in Dean's Court. And I would often walk along the shore there, and along the sands, and along the cobbles, and I would look at the stones, and I would say, these cobblestones were here before your country was founded. This place is ancient, and there is so much history here. That alone created, I think, an appreciation for place and depth and human experience over time and centuries. But of course, what really made the place what it was the people. And it's very picturesque, it's quite beautiful, but the people brought that place to life. Douglas Dunn brought storytelling to life for me and encouraged me in ways that I realized, first of all, I need to stop taking things so darn seriously, because he could bring humor to everything. And with that incisive wit, he said, well, why don't you just say it this way? If that's what you mean, just say it that way. And I did, and it got better. But I had wonderful experiences there as a rowing coach. I was able to get involved with the boat club. And I had some great experiences at Strathclyde Park and up in Dundee, out on the waters and working with young people. The School of English there, I think, provides a wonderful international experience of diversity, of seeing people's points of view coming from different parts of the world, and that informs different reads on storytelling. It lends the benefit to students of seeing how other people articulate their ideas and how they form their craft. So I just found both the geographic location, the history to be very compelling, but really the people and the warmth and the energy and the creative spirit and just good humor of the entire university community to be quite welcoming and very rewarding. And I remember it quite fondly.
It's wonderful. I'm so pleased to hear that, and that is excellent. And I hope we get to actually welcome you back to St Andrews in person one day in the not too distant future. So unfortunately, I think our time is now drawing to a close here, but I'm sure you'll all join me in saying a huge thank you to Paul for his time and wonderful insights this evening, and my warmest thanks actually to you all for joining us and sharing in our literary adventures. We look forward to welcoming you back to our next virtual events, and wherever you are in the world, take care and stay safe. Thank you so much all, and good night from St Andrews.